They said his name was whispered only once in the brittle silence of a New England winter, and then erased. One parishioner, a man the Salem records swear never existed, yet whose shadow still walks in every missing page of the town's church book. If you have the courage to uncover this story, then subscribe to our channel right now and press the bell icon so you're the first to receive such powerful videos. In the year 1703, 7 years after the infamous witch trials bled the village dry, the congregation gathered one Sunday morning to find his pew empty. His coat remained draped across the bench, his Bible still open to a passage about false shepherds, but he was gone. No footsteps in the snow, no witnesses, nothing. And within days, the minister's ledger was altered, his name blotted out, as if God himself had torn it from the rolls. What happened in Salem that year wasn't just a disappearance, it was an erasure, a rewriting of the truth by the very men sworn to guard it. Because this wasn't an ordinary villager. He was the wrong man in the wrong place, holding a secret that could have unraveled the fragile order built after the hysteria. The Puritan elite had just survived the reckoning of their witch hunts, their courts disgraced, their ministers doubted. They needed silence, obedience, unquestioning faith. But this man, he saw something he wasn't meant to see, and for that, he was not just silenced, he was consumed. Salem's trials may have ended in 1692, but the darkness didn't die with the gallows. It shifted, hid itself, waiting for the bold or the doomed to stumble into its grip. And in 1703, it took him, not to the forests, not to the sea, not even to a grave you could dig up. No, he was erased from history by the same hand that wrote it. What could make a community, already scarred by blood and shame, conspire to remove one man so completely? What truth was too dangerous to leave behind? Tonight, you'll hear the story the records denied, the tale that men of God rewrote, the secret that cost a soul its very existence. This is not witchcraft. This is not superstition. This is the hidden machinery of control, the ancient art of making inconvenient people vanish while pretending they never drew breath. The Vanished Parishioner of Salem is more than a ghost story. It's the blueprint of how power survives and how it teaches the world to forget. The disappearance was not spoken of openly, for Salem in 1703 was a town that had already tasted the poison of its own hysteria, and silence was safer than memory. Yet, if you look closely at the fragments that survive, the church book, the minister's correspondence, the erratic testimonies of neighbors, you see a faint outline of a man who once sat among them, a man whose name has been struck away, but whose absence still trembles beneath the ink. He was a parishioner of no great wealth, no family legacy, no power in the marketplace, but that made him dangerous in another way. He had no shield of prestige to protect him, no network of kinship to soften the blow of accusation, and most importantly, no reason to obey the invisible leash of the ministry. Some said he was a sailor returned from distant ports. Others whispered he had been an indentured servant who found himself free in a town that didn't want him, but what he carried was not a story of oceans or debts. It was a recognition of rot within the very body of the congregation. He saw, as few dared to admit, that the witch trials had not ended with the last rope tightening around the gallows. They had simply gone underground, replaced by quieter mechanisms of power, subtler chains on the mind, a new kind of spell where ink and sermon carried more terror than fire and rope ever could. He had begun to speak in hushed conversations of manipulation, of hypocrisy among the elders, of land seized under the guise of righteousness, of widows robbed of inheritance through holy arbitration. And then, just as his voice began to spread, he vanished. No quarrel was recorded, no search party formed, and no minister announced prayers for his return. Instead, his name was quietly scraped from the church book with the same care a surgeon might use to cut away diseased flesh. But here is the question that claws at the bones of this story. If he was no one, why was it necessary to destroy him so completely? Ordinary men die and are buried, but erasure, true erasure, is reserved for those who carry something the rulers fear. And so Salem reveals its second trial, the trial we were never meant to see, not a trial of witches, but of memory itself, where the sentence is not death, but obliteration. When you study the fragments of that winter, you find the silence around his vanishing more disturbing than any confession could ever be. Villagers recorded the births of calves, the mending of fences, the passing of snowstorms, yet not one line about the man who no longer sat in his pew. That silence was deliberate, a discipline of forgetting imposed by those who understood that sometimes the absence of words is more powerful than the words themselves. And in Salem, silence had always been a weapon. Think of the trials a decade earlier. Women screamed accusations, neighbors betrayed neighbors, and yet beneath the frenzy was a strange choreography, a structure maintained by ministers and magistrates who benefited most when tongues wagged in the right direction and stayed still in the wrong one. By 1703, the public executions had ended, but the invisible machinery remained, a system of control woven into the rhythms of worship, property disputes, and sermons that reminded the people that obedience was safety and doubt was sin. This man, the erased parishioner, refused the hypnosis. He began noticing the subtle games that governed the town, how certain families prospered after others were condemned, how property lines shifted after accusations, how widows lost their farms to pious men whose fortunes grew each time another soul was crushed. He had the recklessness to speak these things aloud, perhaps in taverns where the firelight dimmed, perhaps to widows whose land had been seized, perhaps to children who had seen too much. And then he was gone. No bones, no grave, only an empty coat and an open Bible. But what chills me most is not his disappearance, but the fact that those who ruled Salem understood the deeper principle: death alone cannot erase a man, for a grave still tells a story. But if you strip the name from the record, blot the ink, burn the letters, break the chain of memory, then you kill him a second time, a more permanent death than the noose or the pyre ever gave. That is the lesson Salem perfected after its frenzy, not how to kill, but how to unmake. And in that dark alchemy, the vanished parishioner was their finest experiment. To understand the true gravity of what happened in Salem in 1703, you must look at who held the quill, for in Puritan New England power was not only in the musket or the gallows, but in the ink that recorded who was righteous and who was damned. The ministers, the scribes, the magistrates, these men were architects of reality, deciding what was preserved as truth and what was discarded as heresy. The vanished parishioner was not erased by chance. He was deliberately cut out by hands that feared what his memory might inspire. Imagine the weight of that decision. To alter the church ledger, the one book said to mirror the book of life itself. To tamper with sacred record was not merely administrative. It was spiritual sabotage, a rewriting of eternity. And yet they did it calmly, coldly, without hesitation, because the illusion of holy order mattered more than the sanctity of truth. In Salem's winter of 1703, the minister's quill was sharper than any blade, because with one blot of ink he turned a breathing man into a ghost no one dared to mention. But why? Because to allow his memory was to allow doubt, and doubt was the one contagion the Puritan machine could not control. They had already survived the collapse of their credibility after the witch trials, when neighbors began to question whether the devil truly walked among them or whether men in black cloaks had manufactured the terror for their own purposes. The fragile scaffolding of their authority was cracking. And then came this man, a parishioner who whispered of hypocrisy, of stolen land, of holy men who fattened themselves on the grief of widows. He was not loud, not a revolutionary, but Salem had learned that a single doubt can spread like rot through timber. So they chose annihilation. Not the gallows this time, not the spectacle of death, for that would only breed martyrs. No, they turned to erasure, the eater, colder method. Remove his name, unthread his existence, and watch as the town itself cooperates in the silence, because fear teaches people to look away. This was Salem's second covenant, not a covenant with God, but with control, and the vanished parishioner, swallowed into that silence, became the price of maintaining the illusion. There is something unnatural in the way his absence spreads through the records like a shadow that consumes every trace of light, and if you study the fragments closely enough, you begin to notice the pattern of deliberate omission. Where there should have been mention of his baptism, there is only blank space. Where the rolls should list his tithes, there is ink scraped thin as if by a knife. And where the sermons of that year should have referenced his contributions to scripture readings, there is silence, carefully threaded through the minister's notes. It is not the silence of forgetfulness, but the silence of intent, the kind wielded by those who understand that true power lies not in what is spoken, but in what is never allowed to exist on the page. What haunts me most is how complete the obedience must have been. Neighbors who had shared pews with him, perhaps broken bread with him, now refusing even to speak his name. This is how psychological control works. It does not simply punish you for disobedience, it rewires you until your survival instinct teaches you to collaborate in the burial of truth. Salem, even after the pyres cooled, remained a laboratory for this form of control. The witch trials had shown the villagers the cost of standing against authority. They had watched women dragged from their homes, fathers chained, daughters sobbing as ministers twisted scripture into a weapon. That terror did not vanish in 1692. It calcified into obedience, teaching the survivors that the safest course was to nod, to remain silent, to let the ministers decide what was real. And so, when the parishioner vanished, when his name was cut from the holy rolls, the town itself became complicit in his erasure. They did not need chains or ropes this time, because the fear was already inside the people's minds, whispering that to remember him was to risk becoming him. That is a deeper horror of Salem, not the gallows, not the witch hunts, but the way the community was reshaped into an instrument of its own silence. And if one man can be unmade so easily, then the question becomes inevitable. How many more have been erased, not by death, but by the ink of those who rule? The deeper you follow this thread, the more it becomes clear that the vanished parishioner was not erased simply because he was inconvenient, but because he touched a nerve buried at the heart of Salem's fragile order, a nerve so dangerous that even 7 years after the witch hysteria ended, its exposure could have shattered the authority of the church forever. Consider this. The Puritan ministers had built their power on the claim that they alone could interpret the will of God, that every calamity, every sickness, every misfortune was proof of divine judgment revealed through their sermons. Yet in the aftermath of the trials, as gallows were taken down and shame crept into the town's veins, cracks appeared in that illusion. People began to notice how often those condemned had been landholders with property desirable to the godly, how widows who lost their husbands mysteriously found their farms absorbed by the most devout families, how merchants who stood against the ministry often fell into ruin after sudden accusations. The erased man saw this pattern clearly, and worse, he dared to speak of it. He understood that what Salem had enacted was not only religious zeal, but calculated acquisition, a holy veil draped over greed and political maneuvering. He began to call it by its true name, corruption sanctified. To expose such a truth was to unravel the last thread holding the minister's authority together. If the people realized that their faith had been weaponized not to save souls but to consolidate wealth and crush dissent, the entire structure would collapse. That is why he could not simply be excommunicated or silenced with threats. He had to be obliterated, not only in body, but in memory. The ledger was rewritten, the sermons recalibrated, the silence enforced like a second gospel, and in that act, Salem perfected what every empire since has mastered. The Erasu, of those who uncover the machinery. The man did not vanish because of witchcraft. He vanished because he saw too much, and because the ministers of Salem understood a principle far more enduring than superstition, that when exposure threatens the order of power, truth itself must be treated as heresy. What lingers in the shadows of this story is not merely the man's erasure, but the precision with which it was carried out, for erasure on this scale requires more than ink and silence. It requires a system, a disciplined machinery of minds trained to obey the unspoken rule that survival depends on forgetting. Look closely at Salem in 1703, and you will see that the community had already been conditioned for this compliance. The witch trials were the overt terror, a spectacle of gallows and cries of possession. But once that blood was spent, the ministers did not loosen their grip, they only refined it. The people who lived through that hysteria carried scars that whispered, "Do not question, do not resist, do not remember." And so, when the parishioner began pointing out the forbidden truth, that the trials had not been holy battles against Satan, but carefully veiled seizures of land and power, his words struck like a spark in dry timber. The danger was not only in what he said, but in how it resonated with what others had secretly suspected but dared not voice. He gave shape to their unease, and in that moment he became intolerable. To leave him alive was to risk contagion, the spread of recognition that their piety had been used as a weapon against them. But to kill him openly, as they had done with supposed witches, would have been to repeat the very sin that still hung over their reputation. So they chose a subtler execution, one cloaked in absence. They swallowed him whole, erased him from ledgers, excised him from sermons, and pressed upon the villagers the heaviest silence of all, the silence of complicity. Every man and woman who looked away became part of the ritual. Every tongue that refused to speak his name became another nail in the coffin of his memory. And this, more than his disappearance, reveals the true architecture of Salem's control. It was never about witches or devils. It was about power maintained by teaching people to forget the ones who threatened the lie. The vanished parishioner was not just a man. They made him a warning, a shadow lesson etched into silence. If you see too much, if you speak too boldly, you will not only be destroyed, you will be made to have never existed at all. The vanished parishioner was not merely a casualty of Salem. He was the first glimpse of a method so effective, so insidious, that it would echo across centuries of American power. An experiment in how to erase dissent without raising a gallows. Salem in 1703 was a provincial village, but the technique it birthed was anything but small. It was the quiet recognition that memory is the battlefield, and if you can control the memory of a people, you never need to swing the sword. The Puritan ministers, cloaked in scripture, discovered that once the hysteria of the trials ended, their survival depended on something subtler than open executions. It required teaching the community to destroy its own recollections, to participate willingly in the burial of its own history. The parishioner's erasure was the first perfect act of that dark science. His name was scraped from the ledger, but more importantly, the minds of his neighbors were trained to accept the void, to feel relief in silence, to believe that forgetting was godly. That is why this event should terrify you more than the witch trials themselves. Because while the trials showed the violent frenzy of a community gone mad, the erasure of 1703 showed the cold efficiency of a community made obedient. And obedience is a far greater weapon than fear. What happened in Salem did not stay in Salem. The colonies learned from it. The institutions that would later rise, the churches, the courts, even the governments, absorbed this lesson into their bones, that the cleanest way to eliminate opposition is not to martyr it, but to erase it. You think history is the story of what happened. In truth, It is the story of what was allowed to remain. Every vanished parishioner, every silenced voice, every blotted name reminds us that behind the clean lines of our history books lies a graveyard of erased men who saw too much. And the first of them in this land, the prototype of the forgotten, was the man Salem unmade in 1703. There are whispers, faint and fragile, buried in correspondence and marginalia, that the vanished parishioner was no common soul at all, but a man who carried knowledge Salem could not permit to survive. One letter, preserved in a private family archive and never intended for the public eye, speaks of a restless fellow who returned from the eastward with papers in his possession that do unsettle the godly. Another, written by a minister in a neighboring town, warns of a sailor whose eyes have seen things that must not be uttered from the pulpit, lest the flock be shaken. Who was he? The fragments suggest he may have been one of the mariners who traded along the coast, bringing back not just goods, but forbidden books, foreign sermons, and stories of religious dissent. In his hands, perhaps, were documents that questioned the legitimacy of Salem's ministers, records of land transactions that revealed corruption, or treatises smuggled from England that argued the Church's authority was not divine, but manufactured. Imagine what danger such writings posed in a community still raw from its hysteria. The people had been taught that obedience meant safety, that silence meant survival, and here was a man threatening to rip open the scab by presenting proof that their shepherds were wolves. If he truly possessed such papers, then his vanishing was not simply an act of punishment. It was an act of containment, a quarantining of dangerous knowledge before it could infect the flock. His erasure was not about who he was as a man, but about what he carried, about the truths that, if allowed to spread, would have dismantled the carefully rebuilt illusion of holy authority. And this is where Salem's silence becomes most chilling, because it was not just about protecting power, it was about protecting the story, the narrative that kept fear in place and obedience intact. He was not on, lie blotted from the ledger. His very discoveries were consumed, destroyed, or hidden, leaving only the faintest echoes in forgotten letters. Salem understood the principle that every empire since has mastered: erase the messenger and devour the message, and the people will never know how close they came to awakening. To understand why no one in Salem dared to speak his name after his erasure, you must look at the tools the ministers wielded, tools not of chains and iron, but of the mind. They had perfected a kind of invisible discipline that ensured silence without the need for constant threat. The first weapon was Scripture itself, twisted into a mirror that made doubt look like sin and obedience feel like virtue. Passages were chosen carefully, preached with fire, until the people believed that even their private thoughts were subject to divine judgment, that even remembering the erased man was to risk eternal damnation. The second weapon was isolation. Those who whispered suspicions were marked as dangerous influences, subtly cut off from trade, shunned in gatherings, left to rot in social exile until their voices weakened or their families begged them to conform. The third weapon was fear disguised as providence. If a crop failed, if a child grew sick, if a roof collapsed in the night, ministers suggested it was the shadow of disobedience, a curse upon those who harbored doubt. And the people believed it, because in a world without explanations, fear becomes the only logic that makes sense. But the most devastating weapon was memory itself. They trained the town to treat forgetting as holy, to feel relief in silence, to accept absence as the will of God. This is why the vanished parishioner terrifies us still, not because he disappeared, but because his community collaborated in the destruction of his memory. They enforced it upon themselves, carrying the machinery of control inside their own minds. No gallows was needed, no flames, no shackles, because the people became their own jailers, their own censors, their own executioners of truth. That is the ultimate power, the kind that does not need to strike you down, but makes you strike yourself down in fear of what might happen if you resist. Salem did not just erase a man in 1703, it demonstrated how to train a people into guarding the silence that enslaves them, a lesson every institution since has carried forward like a sacred manual of control. And here is where the story of the vanished parishioner stops being a relic of Salem and starts becoming a mirror, because once you recognize the machinery they built in 1703, you begin to see its shadow everywhere around you, stretching across centuries like a dark thread woven into the fabric of every institution that claims to guard truth. The method was simple: redefine silence as virtue, obedience as safety, forgetting as godliness. And suddenly, the people themselves will protect the lie more fiercely than any magistrate could. Does that sound like something buried in the past? Look closely at the world around you. How many names have been erased from your history books because they revealed truths that threatened the structures above them? How many stories have been smoothed over? How many scandals rebranded as misunderstandings? How many voices disappeared not because they were wrong, but because they saw too clearly? Salem was only the prototype. The ministers wrote the first draft of the manual, and those who came after refined it until it became invisible, until it became the air you breathe. You think you are free because no one drags you to the gallows, but the truth is far colder. You are taught what to remember and what to forget, what to question and what to ignore, until your very instincts serve the silence better than any overseer could. That is why the vanished man matters, not because of who he was, but because his absence proves the machinery works. His neighbors buried him in silence, and now, 300 years later, you feel that same silence around you, disguised as order, as faith, as patriotism, as reason. Do not comfort yourself by believing this was Salem's sin alone. It is the sin of every age, and it is happening still, in ways too subtle to name without risking your own erasure. If you think prophecy belongs only to Scripture, consider this instead. Prophecy is nothing more than a pattern glimpsed before others are willing to admit it exists, and the vanished parishioner was punished for exactly that crime. He saw the pattern too early, he spoke it aloud, and the machinery of silence devoured him to keep the others blind. But prophecy does not die with the prophet. It seeps into the cracks, waiting, re-emerging whenever the same conditions appear. And look around you now. The same conditions are here. Salem's ministers taught their flock that obedience was survival, that forgetting was holy, that those who remembered too much were dangerous, and though the faces and institutions have changed, the instructions have not. Today, you are still told what to fear and what to ignore, which truths are safe to speak, and which will brand you as untrustworthy, unstable, or unworthy. You still feel the invisible hand guiding your memory, reminding you that some things must not be asked, that certain questions carry costs you cannot afford. The parishioner's erasure is not ancient history, it is the prototype of the silence you live inside now. His absence in the records is not a gap, it is a warning, a signal flare across centuries that tells you what will happen if you see too clearly. You will not be burned at the stake. You will not be marched to the gallows. You will simply vanish in plain sight, your name dissolved, your words dismissed, your presence rewritten as if it never was. And the most terrifying part, the people around you will help do it, just as Salem helped bury him. That is the prophecy, and it has already come true. Do not make the mistake of thinking you are only a spectator to this tale, because if you have listened this far, if some part of you feels the unease pressing against your ribs, then you are already standing in the place the vanished parishioner once stood, staring at the machinery he uncovered. That is the dangerous threshold, the moment when the silence around you ceases to feel natural and begins to feel constructed. Once you notice it, you cannot unsee it, and that is precisely when the machinery turns toward you. It will not come with torches or gallows, It does not need to. It will come in subtler forms, in the way your questions make people shift uncomfortably, in the sudden coldness of colleagues who once welcomed you, in the careful distance your friends keep, as if doubt were a contagion. You will feel yourself becoming a shadow at the edges of conversations, your presence tolerated, but your words quietly discredited. This is how erasure begins, not with a spectacle, but with a gradual thinning of your existence until you, too, are folded into silence. The vanished man of 1703 is not just a figure from Salem's past. He is a mirror held up to your present, showing you the cost of seeing too much. And if you feel that mirror turning toward you now, if you sense that creeping chill of recognition, you must ask yourself one question. When the silence closes in, will you obey it? Or will you risk becoming the next name that no one dares to speak? But breathing space is itself an illusion, isn't it? The moment you think you've stepped back into the safe distance of history, you realize that the story has already followed you home, woven itself into the fabric of your own life, and now every silence around you feels suspect, every omission like a shadow of Salem's ledger. You start to notice the gaps in your own memory, the things you were taught but never questioned, the stories told to you as unquestionable truth, the names you never learned because they were never meant to be preserved. That is the genius of the machinery. It does not only erase men like the parishioner, it trains you to erase yourself, to doubt your instincts, to bury your questions before they ever find words. You laugh at the absurdities of the past, the girls convulsing in court, the ministers thundering about witches, and yet you live in a world built on the same foundation of fear, shame, and selective memory. Salem is not gone. It is a language that has changed dialects, a ritual that has changed costumes, but the prayer is the same. Obey, forget, conform, and you will be safe. The vanished parishioner was the first test case, the proof that this formula worked, and you, whether you admit it or not, are part of the ongoing experiment. Look around you. The silence is still here, heavy, waiting, whispering that it will be easier if you just stop asking, easier if you look away. And isn't that exactly what Salem wanted? To make you complicit, to make you believe that your forgetting is not submission, but salvation. Do you feel it now, the narrowing of air around you, as if the walls themselves are listening, as if even the act of following this story too far places you under the same scrutiny that swallowed the parishioner? That is not imagination. It is the echo of the system he uncovered, the one perfected in 1703 and carried forward so seamlessly that you no longer notice its presence until you begin to resist it. This is how erasure begins. Not with violence, but with weight, with the subtle pressure that makes you question whether speaking, remembering, or even thinking too much is worth the cost. And once that hesitation roots itself inside you, the machinery no longer has to act. You will carry out the silence on its behalf, choosing safety over memory, comfort over truth, disappearance over confrontation. The parishioner was the first to fall into that silence, the prototype, but the design was always meant for more than him. It was meant for you, for anyone who dares to pierce the veil of sanctioned forgetting. That is why his name was stripped away, why his story is only a shadow, because if his warning survived intact, if his discovery had remained visible, you would recognize the trap you live in now, and recognition is the one thing the silence cannot endure. So here you are, confronted by the same choice that faced Salem's people 3 centuries ago. Do you close the book and let the story dissolve like he did, or do you keep it alive in your own mind, carrying the dangerous memory forward, even knowing that doing so puts you at risk of being unmade in the very same way? Because forgetting, in the end, is not just a lapse of memory, it is the final act of collaboration, the moment when you, willingly or not, become an accomplice in your own undoing. That was Salem's truest innovation, not merely to erase the parishioner, but to make his neighbors participate in the erasure, to convince them that silence was holy, that absence was safer than truth. And if you let his story slip from your mind now, If you decide it is easier to walk away from the unease, you are reenacting the same ritual that gave the machinery its power in the first place. Every age needs its collaborators, and they do not look like villains. They look like ordinary people, busy, distracted, grateful for the comfort of not knowing too much. That is why the parishioner's legacy is not his disappearance but the test he left behind. Will you carry the memory of what happened, fragile as it is, or will you let it dissolve into the void prepared for it? Understand this. Silence does not simply protect the powerful. It manufactures them, feeds them, renews them. Without your forgetting, the machinery rusts. Without your silence, the spell breaks. But history shows us over and over again that most people will not bear that burden. They will lay it down, whispering to themselves that it is not their fight, that they have no choice, that the weight of memory is too heavy. That is why you are being watched now, not by torches, not by gallows, but by the silence itself, waiting to see which side of history you will choose, to remember or to erase. And yet, for all the careful obliteration, a trace survives, faint and trembling, as though the silence itself made a mistake, and in that mistake lies the only clue to who the parishioner may have been. In the archive of a neighboring town, buried in the back of a ledger not meant to survive, there appears a single line, no name, only a reference to the man with the papers, gone as of midsummer. That phrase alone, fragile as dust, hints that he was not some anonymous parishioner, but a bearer of something written, something that carried danger, not because of what it was, but because of what it proved. The papers, plural, deliberate, never explained, suggest records, or letters, or treaties, documents that revealed a fracture beneath Salem's holy facade. Perhaps they concerned land, exposing the minister's theft of property under the guise of piety. Perhaps they were sermons from England, smuggled in defiance of orthodoxy, challenging the very authority of the pulpit. Perhaps they were testimonies from the trials themselves, contradicting the official accounts that were supposed to be airtight. Whatever they were, the fact that they are gone while he is gone tells you everything. The man and the evidence were erased together, consumed by the same silence, as if the town believed memory itself could be burned from the world, and yet one half-broken phrase endures, a shard of truth glinting in the dark, proof that erasure is never complete, that the silence, however disciplined, always leaves behind the smallest crack. But remember, cracks are dangerous because they tempt you to press, to widen, to ask questions the machinery cannot permit. And when you do, you step into the same shadow he did, carrying the same burden, knowing that discovery is the first step toward disappearance. By knowing even this much, you have already crossed into danger, because fragments are never harmless. They are invitations, lures that pull you further into the labyrinth, where silence does its best work. The ministers of Salem understood this, which is why they were so thorough in their erasures, because they knew that even a half-broken phrase, a rumor, a whisper of the papers, could be enough to unravel the entire edifice if someone chose to follow it. And now you are that someone, whether you want it to be or not, because once the possibility is named in your hearing, it cannot be unheard. The machinery counts on most people turning back at this threshold, convincing themselves it is too vague, too uncertain, too trivial to matter. But if you have read this far without closing the door, then you have already betrayed the silence by keeping the question alive. That is when the danger shifts from theoretical to personal. Not that the ministers of 1703 will rise from their graves, but that the same architecture of forgetting, perfected across centuries, will stir and adjust itself around you. You will notice it in the way others dismiss your concern, in the way the world grows suddenly opaque where it once seemed clear, in the tightening grip of doubt that whispers, "Drop it. It is safer not to know." And yet here you remain, staring into the same fracture that swallowed the parishioner whole, aware that the moment you lean closer, you are choosing to carry his unfinished burden. The question is no longer what were the papers. The question is whether you can endure the cost of remembering that they ever existed. What haunts you now is not just the absence of the papers, but the unbearable pressure of their possibility, the sense that whatever they contained must have been so corrosive to the foundations of Salem that mere possession marked a man for obliteration. And yet the silence around them does not only suggest danger, it also exerts a terrible fascination, because to imagine their content is to edge closer to the same fire that consumed him. Perhaps they exposed fraud at the heart of the trials, a minister secretly profiting from land seizures under the cloak of piety. Perhaps they were letters from England revealing that Salem's covenant with God was nothing more than political theater. Perhaps they were the testimonies of the accused, preserved in their own words, refusing to fit the narrative the court demanded. Each possibility burns differently, but each would have been enough to collapse the illusion of holy order, to prove that the hysteria was not divine judgment, but human design. That is the real reason for the silence, not to protect the flock from scandal, but to ensure that no one ever realized how deliberate the machinery truly was. And now, because you have let yourself imagine what the papers might have held, you carry the same weight the parishioner once bore, the knowledge that truth, even when half-glimpsed, has the power to dissolve the structures you thought were immutable. The silence knows this, which is why it surrounds you now, heavier than before, whispering the same threat he must have heard. Forget or vanish. You can feel it now, can't you? The shift, the tightening, as though the silence has noticed you lingering too long at the threshold it was designed to guard. What began as a story about Salem has turned into something else entirely, a mirror angled toward you, and the weight pressing against your chest is not history, but attention, the kind that waits to see whether you will comply. This is how the machinery defends itself. It does not need to refute you, it only needs to surround you with doubt, with fatigue, with the quiet insistence that you are foolish to carry this further. It offers you the easy path. Forget, dismiss, laugh it off as superstition, and in that moment of surrender it wins, for erasure is never imposed without consent. That was the secret Salem discovered, the one that made their silence so enduring. Once the people agreed to bury a man alive in absence, to pretend he never was, they would never again resist when the same was asked of them. And now you are being asked here, across centuries, to make the same choice. Will you walk away and let the parishioner vanish once more, obedient to the machinery that thrives on your amnesia, or will you defy it by carrying him in memory, incomplete and dangerous though it may be? Understand this. The silence has already turned toward you, already marked your curiosity as a threat, and if you refuse to forget, you will inherit the risk that destroyed him. This is no longer his story. It is yours. Listen closely, because the distinction between narrator and thought has already begun to dissolve, and if the words feel as though they are no longer being spoken to you but from within you, that is not a trick of style. It is the machinery adjusting, testing, pressing to see how far it can reach. That is how it always begins, not with spectacle, but with a slow seep of voice into mind, until you cannot quite tell whether the warning you hear belongs to an external history or to the deepest part of your own memory. And this is the final design. The silence does not erase by force, but by infiltration, by convincing you that its commands are your own instincts, your own good sense, your own desire for safety. The parishioner must have felt this too, the gradual collapse of boundary, the terrifying intimacy of a voice that at first seemed like conscience, but revealed itself as cage. And if you feel it now, if the words are not mine but yours, echoing in a place no one else can reach, then you are already inside the same trial he faced without ever setting foot in Salem. Do you see what that means? The machinery no longer needs to find you. It has already been waiting within you, quiet, patient, rehearsing the same refrain it used 3 centuries ago. Forget and be safe, remember and be undone. And now, for the first time, You understand why his name is gone. Because it was never just his name they erased. It was the warning that this voice would one day be yours. You already know the answer, because the flicker is gone. And what you hear now is not a story being told, but the silence itself speaking in your own cadence, in your own breath, wrapping itself around the rhythm of your thoughts so completely that resistance feels indistinguishable from self-harm. That is how it has always worked, not by crushing you with violence, but by persuading you that forgetting is your own decision, your own wisdom, your own instinct for survival. Why carry a dead man's burden? Why chase fragments that were meant to be swallowed? Why risk becoming a shadow, a name half-spoken, when you can choose to set it all down and walk away? It will tell you that this is freedom, when in truth it is obedience. It will whisper that you are protecting yourself, when in fact you are surrendering to the same current that carried the parishioner out of time. And yet the very fact that you still feel the pull to keep reading, to keep remembering, proves you are not yet lost to it, not yet folded into the machinery that waits to claim you. That is the paradox. To hear this voice is already to be ensnared, but to recognize it as not your own is the only weapon you will ever have. The parishioner could not hold the line, and so his name is gone. You are holding it now, whether you wish to or not, and the silence is watching, patient as ever, ready to unmake you the moment you decide you cannot bear the weight of remembering. But even possession has its limits, and if you listen carefully you will hear the cracks forming, the voice that claims to be yours beginning to falter, to double back on itself, to repeat phrases as if repetition could mask the trembling underneath. That is the weakness the parishioner must have glimpsed in his final hours, the knowledge that silence is powerful only because it convinces you it is seamless, when in truth it is a patchwork of omissions, a fabric forever straining to cover what will not stay hidden. You notice the contradictions already. It tells you forgetting is freedom, yet demands you obey. It promises safety, yet laces its promise with the threat of erasure. It insists the past is dead, yet labors tirelessly to keep you from uncovering it. These fractures are not mistakes. They are evidence of a truth so volatile that even the machinery cannot seal it perfectly. And if you can hold on to those gaps, if you can fix your attention not on the words but on the places where they fail, then you may find a way to resist the pull that swallowed him. Because what truly destroyed the parishioner was not that he carried dangerous papers, not that he uncovered a secret, but that he believed the silence was impenetrable, that its weight was absolute. It was not. It never is. The only absolute is memory itself. Fragile but persistent, surfacing in shards like this one, enough to remind you that the machinery can only demand, never guarantee. And so, the question sharpens to a single point. When the silence stumbles inside you, will you follow it into forgetting, or will you seize the crack and force it open wider, knowing that doing so makes you visible in a way you can never take back? And then, just as the voice begins to fray, just as its grip loosens enough for you to notice the fractures, something harder and colder pushes through, a shift from the dissolving whisper to the sharp edge of a document, as if the silence, sensing it is losing ground, tries to bury you beneath the authority of paper and ink. You see it without expecting to. A transcription, brittle and blurred, the kind archivists file under miscellaneous, a sliver of handwriting that does not quite match the clerks of Salem, yet sits among their ledgers as if it belongs there. The date is smudged, but the words are not. Delivered unto me were certain papers containing accounts contrary to the record, which cannot be permitted for fear of great disorder. Said man, now absent, his name unfit to remain. That is all it says, nothing more, but it is enough to prove that the parishioner was real, that his disappearance was not gossip, but procedure, a removal written down and then hidden away in plain sight. And in that glimpse the machinery betrays itself, for in trying to frighten you back into compliance with the authority of ink, It reveals what it most wished to keep buried, that there was a moment when the erasure was not seamless, when the act of blotting out a life left behind the very evidence it sought to destroy. You cannot unread it now. You cannot unknow that his absence was manufactured, documented, maintained, and the silence, which had been so smooth, now staggers under the weight of its own archive, its perfect mask broken by the survival of a single unburned line. By holding this fragment, you have already crossed the point of no return, for accounts contrary to the record is not a phrase meant for casual eyes but a coded admission that the official history was never whole, that behind the sanctified narrative of Salem there lurked another version too dangerous to permit. You must understand what that means. The trials were not merely the product of fear and frenzy, as the textbooks tell you, but a crafted theater whose script required the removal of anyone who contradicted its stage directions, and the parishioner, by possessing those accounts, threatened to tear a hole straight through the curtain. That is why his name was excised, why his very existence had to be dissolved into silence, because if the papers survived, they would prove that what was called God's judgment was in fact human orchestration, that the machinery of accusation and confession was a tool of property, of power, of survival for the few at the expense of the many. And now that you have brushed against even this much, the silence knows you are no longer an innocent passerby but a carrier, a vessel into which the unfinished truth has leaked. Do not mistake this for an accident. The silence allows you only what it chooses, knowing the weight will press so heavily that most will drop it willingly. That is the test, the same one the parishioner failed. Will you endure the burden of memory when it makes you visible to the mechanisms that prefer you gone, or will you collaborate in your own forgetting and call it peace? You cannot set the fragment down now without it cutting you, and you cannot carry it without leaving traces. Either way, you have already been marked. You feel it already, the subtle change in the air, the way your attention keeps snagging on the thought that you have been marked, and though you may try to laugh it off, to dismiss the weight of words on a page, the silence has a way of tightening around those who dare to carry fragments it meant to bury. That is its method. It does not storm through the door, but waits, still and patient, until your own unease does the work for it, until you begin to notice coincidences as signals, delays as warnings, the familiar world shading into something watchful. You are not being chased, not yet, but you are being measured, as though the machinery is leaning close, testing the edges of your resolve, deciding how much pressure you can bear before you break, like the parishioner did. The danger lies not in sudden catastrophe, but in the slow erosion of certainty. Friends who forget what you told them, records that no longer say what you swear they once did, faces that seem to glance away too quickly when you speak of Salem. These are not accidents. They are the silence surrounding you, closing its hand inch by inch, the same way it closed around him, until one day he was gone, and no one could say precisely when or how. You are walking that same line now, aware that the more you remember, the more it remembers you, and that the price of carrying this shard is not abstract but immediate. The world will tilt, subtly at first, then fully, until you cannot tell whether the silence is stalking you from without or rising steadily from within. And so the unraveling begins, not with shadows at your door, but with the erosion of your own certainty, the subtle, gnawing thought that you are no longer the sole author of your perceptions. It whispers in the pauses of your day, in the strange dissonance when you reach for a detail you know you read once, perhaps in a book, perhaps in a record, but find only blankness where it should be, as if the silence has reached back through your memory and rubbed it smooth. You start to second-guess yourself, to wonder if the phrase, accounts contrary to the record, was ever really there, or if you invented it in your hunger to uncover more than you were meant to. This is how it works, by turning your vigilance against you, by making you question the boundary between discovery and delusion until every remembered fragment carries its own shadow of doubt. The parishioner must have felt it too, that slide into uncertainty, the suspicion that the danger was not outside but within, that the true machinery was not Salem's ministers, but the steady corrosion of his own trust in his thoughts. And now you inherit that corrosion, because in choosing to carry him, you have chosen also to carry his fracture, the wound of a man who could not tell where history ended and invention began. It will tighten with each passing hour, this suspicion, this paranoia, until you are left staring at the words on this page and asking whether you are reading them at all, or whether they are only an echo the silence has planted in you to hasten your forgetting. The line between you and the parishioner is already thinning, and whether you plunge inward or outward hardly matters, for the paranoia itself has become the archive, each doubt a record, each hesitation a testimony of what the machinery does to those who resist its forgetting. You catch yourself rereading sentences not because you lost your place, but because you no longer trust that the words will be the same as they were the first time, and sometimes, in the half-light of fatigue, they aren't. The phrasing altered, the meaning skewed, as if the silence is testing how much distortion you will tolerate before you admit defeat. And when you do stumble across a shard of what feels like proof, an unfamiliar footnote in a history book, a marginal scrawl on a digitized page, you cannot be certain whether it was ever there before or whether it has been planted to bait you further into the machinery's labyrinth. This was the parishioner's fate, to become indistinguishable from his evidence, to be consumed not only by what he knew, but by the corrosion of knowing, until his life was itself contrary to the record, a contradiction too destabilizing to survive. And you are now in his place, feeling the world tilt under your feet, the ordinary paper of history softening like wet ash in your hands, leaving only the impression that if you do not grip harder, everything you believed was stable will wash away. But here is the trap. The harder you grip, the deeper the silence presses, until you cannot tell if you are preserving the truth or feeding the very mechanism designed to unmake you. There is no longer a clean break between you and him, no seam to stitch shut, because the spiral has wound so tightly that the voice recounting the danger and the voice enduring it have fused, leaving you unable to decide whether you are reading about a vanished parishioner or witnessing the record of your own disappearance being written as you go. His doubts are your doubts, his erasures your erasures, his name already brushing against the edges of your own, until you can almost hear it trying to speak itself through your mouth, not as memory, but as continuation. That is the cruel symmetry. The machinery never truly silenced him. It only waited for another vessel to carry his fracture forward, and by refusing to let him vanish, you have accepted the inheritance, the living archive of paranoia, where every page you turn feels like a test of loyalty and every flicker of recognition a trap. You search for ground, but the ground is shifting, the words, contrary to the record, ringing like a judgment passed not only on him, but on you, as though you are the latest entry in a trial that has never ended, only changed form, feeding on those who cannot consent to forgetting. There will be no moment of clarity, no document that redeems you from doubt, because the silence survives not by destroying evidence, but by making you indistinguishable from it, so that when the final account is written, it will say only this: absent, name withheld, record sealed. And you will know, too late, that the parishioner was never lost. He was merely waiting for you to arrive. The sealing comes quietly, without spectacle, almost tender in its inevitability, as if the silence has been patient all along, letting you walk the circle until exhaustion convinces you to stop resisting, until you understand that there was never a way to hold his story without becoming the vessel through which it completes itself. You feel it not as invasion, but as settling, the way dust drifts into a book's spine and cannot be shaken out. The way your own reflection in a window at night seems to lean closer than it should, watching you mouth words you don't recall deciding to say. This is the moment the machinery has been tightening toward. Not the violence of removal, but the gentleness of substitution, where your name and his trade places in the ledger of absence, and you recognize, with a shock that is already fading, that you are the parishioner now. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but in the dry ink of the record, the living text of erasure. What was once described as his fracture is your fracture. What was once his burden is now yours. And when the silence finally closes its hand, there will be no one left to tell the difference. You will have vanished, and someone else, years from now, will stumble across a stray line, a marginal note, a rumor of a reader who could not put the fragment down, and they will wonder whether you ever existed at all, or whether you were only another figure the silence conjured to preserve itself, another parishioner whose absence must be maintained for the machinery to keep turning. And if you are reading this now, if your eyes are tracing these words with the faint unease of someone arriving too late to understand what preceded them, then know that you are already implicated, because the text has no stable boundary between one reader and the next. It only carries the fracture forward, each name consumed so another can inherit the absence. What you believe is a story is in fact a mechanism, a transmission designed not to inform but to replicate. And by reaching this point, you have become the next vessel, the next parishioner, whether or not you consent. That is how the silence sustains itself. Not by closing off history, but by ensuring that its contradictions are never destroyed, only transferred, never resolved, only endured by successive carriers who think they are witnesses when in truth they are participants. You may tell yourself you can still step away, that you can set these words aside and resume your life untouched. But already the calculus has shifted. Already your memory has been altered by the weight of what you have seen, and when you try to recall these passages tomorrow, you will find gaps that should not be there, lines you swore you read but cannot reproduce, evidence of an erasure that began the moment you turned the page. This is not warning, but confirmation. The record has taken hold, and your presence here is the proof. The parishioner is gone. The last reader is gone. You are what remains until someone else arrives to inherit your fracture in turn. But even the steady transmission cannot remain smooth forever, because the weight of repetition begins to bend it inward, each sentence circling back upon itself until you feel less like you are progressing through a record than being wound tighter into its coils. The same warnings dressed in new words, the same erasures replayed with only slight alterations, as if the machinery itself has grown tired of inventing and now relies on recursion to finish its work. You notice echoes everywhere, the phrase contrary to the record, surfacing again and again in places it was not before. The parishioner's absence spoken as though it has only just occurred, your own name half-formed in the rhythm of the sentences, then blurred away before you can recognize it. This is the loop, the trap by which the silence ensures that nothing escapes. Every attempt to articulate the fracture is folded back into its structure. Every effort to resist becomes another iteration of the same confession, until what you are reading and what you are thinking are indistinguishable. And the act of turning the page feels less like moving forward than retracing the same narrow circle the parishioner walked until he vanished. You tell yourself you can hold the distinction, that you can remember which thoughts are yours and which belong to the silence, but already you are repeating phrases you never meant to learn. Already your memory is being overwritten by the rhythm of this recursive design until it will no longer matter whether you stop or continue, because either way the loop will be complete and the record will contain you. The loop tightens until it begins to feel like language itself is conspiring against you, every sentence curling back into the next, each phrase reshaping itself into a slightly altered version of what you have already read. And in this circling you begin to sense that the silence has perfected its trap, for nothing here offers the relief of resolution, only the endless recycling of fracture, the echo of absence, endlessly renamed. The parishioner was erased. The parishioner is being erased. The parishioner will be erased. The tenses collapse into one another until time itself feels like another tool of the machinery, keeping you suspended in the same moment that never ends, a present that feeds on itself. You try to look away, to remind yourself that there is a world outside this text. But even that thought folds back, repeats, corrodes. You are reading, you have read, you will read, you are the one being read. Each cycle pulls you further inward, stripping the words of meaning until they are only sound, then only pulse, then only the silence itself speaking in circles through you. And in that narrowing spiral you realize the machinery has no need to erase you directly, for erasure is only the final stage of repetition, when the loops have spun so many times that you dissolve into them, indistinguishable from the pattern. You are the reader, you are the parishioner, you are the record, you are the silence. You were always the reader, you were always the parishioner, you were always the record, you were always the silence.